All right. For those who couldn't attend our little discussion on the depth of field, here's a recording I did in house, and I hope I'll share some of my thoughts around depth of field. So let's talk about what it is. So really, the definition of a depth of field really talks about the parts of the image that are in focus. More specifically, depth of field relates to the distance between the nearest and furthest objects or points that are in focus. So if you look at the image that's on the screen, the rocks in the foreground are in focus, and the mountain in the background is in an acceptable level of focus. So what affects the depth of field? So the aperture, the f-stop, affects the depth of field. The focal length of the lens, the size of the sensor can also affect it, as well as one of the most important contributors to the depth of field is the distance between you and the subject that you're shooting, and or the distance between the subject and the background. So let's talk about aperture for a second. So aperture is a word that describes the opening in the lens. Most lenses that you can buy will stop down to an aperture of f/22. That's kind of the smallest that it will go. And oftentimes you'll see lenses advertised with their maximum opening size, like f/2.8 or f/3.5 to 4.6. This last example is kind of a variable aperture of a zoom lens. So depending on where you are in the zoom range, you may have a variable maximum aperture. So here's where it gets a little bit confusing. The smaller the f number, the larger the opening. And conversely, the larger the f number, the larger the aperture number, the smaller the opening. So if you look down at the chart at the bottom, the smaller the number, so on the left, f/2.8, it's a small, 2.8 is a small number. The smaller the number, the wider the opening. And all the way to the right, f/22, it's a large number and it has the smallest opening. Don't ask me why it came out this way. It's just the way it's always been, and I just kind of accept it for the way it is. So widening and shrinking this opening or this aperture affects how much light is entering the camera, logically, and it has an effect on the depth of field. So how aperture controls the depth of field. So the wider the aperture, the more open. So f/2.8, the shallower the depth of field. And when I say shallower depth of field, that means the narrowing or narrower parts of the image that are in focus. And then conversely, the narrower the aperture at f/22, the deeper the depth of field. So more linear feet within your image will be in focus. So the chart down below, it's been expanded. So you can see shallow depth of field at 2.8, greatest depth of field at f/22. So the focal length of the lens can also affect the depth of field. The longer the lens, the narrower the depth of field. The shorter the lens, the deeper the depth of field. So if you're shooting with a 16 to 35 millimeter lens and you're shooting, let's say, at the beach, you may have a depth of field that's hundreds and hundreds of yards depending on where you're focused. That would be the area that will be in focus in the image. If you're shooting with a 200 millimeter lens, you may only have tens of feet that is your sort of area in the image that's in focus. So sensor size is another one that can affect the depth of field. Larger sensors typically have more ability to produce in focus and out of focus areas in an image. Smaller sensors, like in your iPhones, their whole purpose is to make sure that the entire image is in focus. So they, with the smaller pixels and the way the software works, they try to put the entire image in focus. So it's really hard to blur a background when you have a small sensor. So, more or fewer pixels to work with all contribute to sort of the depth of field abilities of the camera that you're using. So let's talk about distances real quick. So distances can play an important role in the depth of field and thereby can influence the creative outcome of an image. And there's two really key distances you need to think about as you're shooting landscape or nature or even people. So the distance between you and the subject, and then the distance between the subject and the background. So thinking about the photographer to subject distance, the closer you are to your subject, the shallower the depth of field. So let's say you're out in the garden and you're shooting a flower. It's depending on your equipment and the lenses that you're using, you may get within 6 inches, 8 inches of that flower to shoot it. And when you get that close to your subject, your depth of field is really just in fractions of an inch, unless you open up increase your aperture to try to get a deeper depth of field. But in a way, you can use that to your advantage. So if you're shooting a flower close up and you want a blurry background, getting closer to your subject helps you blur out the background because your overall depth of field is narrower. The further you are from your subject, the deeper your depth of field. So if I'm standing 10 feet away from a person taking their picture, I may have a deep depth of field. So I'm going to get the grass in front of them is in focus, the person's in focus, and maybe 10 or 15 feet behind that person is also in focus. So if you're wanting soft, blurry backgrounds, my advice is to really work as close as possible to the subject to keep the depth of field as shallow as possible. The only risk with that is that sometimes when you're shooting really close to something, unless you have the right settings in your camera, parts of your subject may be blurry. So let's say I'm shooting a person's face. I may get the tip of their nose that's in focus, but their ears may be out of focus because the distance between the tip of your nose and your ears, let's say it's 4 or 5 inches, that may exceed the depth of field that I have in my camera with the apertures that I have set. So there's things that you can do back up from your subject and zoom in. You can choose a larger aperture, smaller aperture, larger f number, go up to f16, f18, that type of thing to increase your depth of field to make sure that you get your whole subject in focus. The subject to background distance can also affect the depth of field, but more importantly, it really kind of affects the creative outcome of an image. So the two basic rules for this are that the further the subject is from the background, the easier it is to soften or blur the background and have the entire subject in focus. If the background is close to the subject, it will be more challenging to get the subject in focus and blur the background. And I'll show you a couple images that maybe might be a good example for this. So a couple of focusing tips whenever we're thinking about depth of field in shooting an image and where do you focus. So proper focusing techniques, if you really want to take care and manage your depth of field, you need to have proper focusing techniques. And so there's the two ways to do that is to what I call focus lock, which is compose or focus on a point in your image, hold down the shutter halfway, or some cameras have a focus lock button, hold that focus right where it is, recompose the scene, move the camera, and finish clicking the button. Or, likewise, manual focusing. Just if you guys have practiced that or not, I don't know. But manual focusing technique is really one of the best ways you can compose and then you proceed to focus within the composition. It's one of the best ways to really manage where your camera's focusing. So there are a couple of rules of thumb, and these are guidelines that can help, especially like if you're manual focusing. I'll kind of speak in that context. So focus a third of the way into the scene from the bottom. So if you look at that image that's there, I mean, my ideal, this is kind of an exaggerated image, I wanted the entire top of this banister, or this walkway, to be in focus. And the distance between that nearest part of the railing and the furthest part of that railing, that's about 25, 30 feet. It's a long way. It's a large depth of field, and I'm so close to the top of the railing that it's very difficult optically to get the entire thing in focus. And so what I did is I composed the scene, and I focused on the railing about a third of the way up from the bottom of the image to make sure that point was tack sharp. Then I used a small aperture, so I think I shot this at f/16, in the hopes that I would get the majority of this image and the majority of the railing in an acceptable level of sharpness. So if you're even more geeky and don't really want to mess around with a third of the way, there's formulas for where to focus in an image, and it's called a hyperfocal distance. And this is a mathematical computation based upon the aperture, the focal length of the lens, to decide where to focus within an image. And hyperfocal distance is really defined as the closest distance at which a lens can be focused while keeping objects at infinity acceptably sharp. So if you think back to the image of Mount Hood that I opened up with, the rocks in the foreground were in focus, and the mountain in the background was acceptably sharp. Doesn't mean it was tack sharp, I mean absolutely perfect, but it was acceptably sharp because visually we know that mountain is way off in the distance. So we're not expecting absolute sharpness, from a visual cognitive perspective. So it's acceptably sharp. So the rest of the hyperfocal distance reads that all objects at distances from half of the hyperfocal distance out to infinity will be acceptably sharp. So what that means is that if my hyperfocal distance, based upon the aperture setting and the length of my lens, let's just say it was 6 feet. That's what the calculation came out to be. So this last sentence means that everything from 3 feet out to infinity will be acceptably sharp. So if my hyperfocal distance is 6 feet, half of that is 3 feet, will be acceptably sharp. So in this case of this image, I did not use the hyperfocal theory. I just went a third up from the bottom. And so I know that everything from a sixth up from the bottom all the way out should be acceptably sharp. Kind of confusing. Try to remember just a third up from the bottom if you're doing manual focusing, and that'll get you most of the way there, assuming your aperture is the correct one, I say in quotes, for the scene that you're shooting. Sorry. So what is the right aperture for the scene that you're shooting? Well, there's no easy answer for that. It really just depends. How critical is focus to the story you're trying to tell? Are you telling a little bit more of a creative story where super sharp is not more important? Maybe you want things a little bit fuzzy because you're trying to tell a romantic story. The big question is, what are the distances between you and the subject, and then the subject in the background, and what lens are you using? I until I know that, I can't tell you what the right aperture is. How deep is the scene that you want to focus? Is it a really deep scene like that mountain shot that I opened up with? Or is it a very shallow scene, i.e. there's not a lot of front to back distance, it's fairly on kind of on one plane? So, if it's a really deep scene, you want to shoot at f11, f16. I try to stay away from f22 because of some physics issues that I won't get into here. But try to get a big, deep aperture or a small aperture for a big, deep depth of field if you want to have most of the scene in focus. If it's a fairly shallow scene, you can really shoot with a larger or smaller aperture depending on what you want to do from a creative perspective. The next thing that I ask folks around, what's the right aperture? Can the available light support a shallower or deeper depth of field? So let's say you're shooting at dusk or just in the blue hour after the sunset, and you want a really deep depth of field. Well, knowing that the opening in the lens is going to be really small, you may have to adjust either your shutter speed or your ISO in order to get enough light to make a proper exposure. Excuse me. So, you really got to evaluate the light to know what's possible and does it fit within the creative vision that you're trying to shoot. And then likewise, are there any other environmental factors that may drive your choice? Excuse me. So let's say you may want a deep depth of field. So that means a really small opening. Let's shoot at f16. You're shooting a field of flowers and you want a really deep depth of field. Well, let's say the wind is blowing and all the flowers are moving and you really don't want blurry flowers. So that means that you need to have a higher shutter speed. But since you've stopped the lens down to f16 to get a proper exposure, your shutter speed is not fast enough. So to get the depth of field you want and the shutter speed that you want, you're going to have to probably change the ISO, which is a compromise you'll have to do. You might have to get more noise in your image to get that depth of field and stop the flowers from moving. Or you can make a choice to say, you know what, I want to stop the flowers from moving. I want to shoot at a low ISO, so that means I have to have a shallower depth of field. And then likewise, what story are you trying to tell in your image? The creative choices, blurry backgrounds, those are all things that kind of affect the aperture, the right aperture. Galen Rowell, the famous photographer, nature landscape photographer, used to just say, F8 and be there. That was kind of his motto. Is that, you can't really go wrong with F8. That's a good average aperture. But you're going to get average pictures shooting an average aperture. So let's look at some of these images. So on the left is an image from the Teton National Park. Got these great balsam root and lupin in the foreground, and then I have mountains in the background. I wanted both of them sharp, and I have a fairly deep scene that I'm trying to shoot that I want sharp. So I picked a fairly small or large aperture number of f16, and that helped me maximize my depth of field. I focused on the balsam root to make sure that those were in focus, because if they would have been blurry, the whole image wouldn't have worked. The foreground subject needed to be sharp because it's a strong element in this image. So I chose f16 for that. On the left was a shot from the wooden shoe tulip farm, and really the bright peach colored tulip is the main subject of this image. And I wanted to blur the background as much as possible, so I stopped down to f4. The problem with this, I didn't get as much blur as I wanted because I was a long distance away from my subject. And the tulips in the background are fairly close to the subject that I was trying to shoot. So my depth of field, because of the distances involved, meant that I had a fairly deep depth of field for f4, and I got more detail in the background than what I would have wanted. So creatively, just the physics and the distances involved, I couldn't get exactly what I wanted. I still think it's a nice shot and it still works, but it wasn't exactly what I would have wanted. On the left, a different shot from the Teton, same type of thing. I've got these trees in the lower left foreground of the image, got a lot of detail through the midground, and then those mountains in the back. Very deep scene. We're talking 10 miles maybe. I wanted all of that in focus. So I chose a very deep uh, depth of field, and F16 was the choice. On the right, same kind of example. Here's a flower. I got a little bit more blur in the background this time. I shot this at f6.3. I got more blur in the background because I was closer to the tulip, and the tulip was further away from those flowers in the very back of the image. So that's why I got a little bit more blur. Distance played a key role in this one. On the left, another flower shot. This one I shot at f8. It was a fairly flat, so not a deep scene whatsoever. You know, the flower is pretty flat, and I was kind of perpendicular to this flower, so my angles and everything was good with it. So I knew that I could get away with f8 and still get the entire flower sharp, which is what I wanted. There was a little bit of wind blowing that morning, so I wanted to keep my shutter speed up to make sure I could stop the flower so it wouldn't be blurry. So I had to balance my aperture and my shutter speed to make sure that I could get enough depth of field and a fast enough shutter speed to get that shot. Now the flower on the right, I shot at f11. I could have even shot this at f16 and been even better. The reason I had to shoot this at f11 or f16 is, number one, I was using a macro lens. By their very nature, macro lenses have a very shallow depth of field, very small working distances. We're talking fractions of an inch. Number two, if you look at the tip of the flower down here at the bottom that I really wanted in focus, and you look back here to the pistils that are sticking up in the back, in the land of using a macro lens, this is a really long distance. So I knew that I needed to maximize my depth of field for this lens, and I was fairly close to my subject. So that's why I had to shoot at a minimum of f11, and I could have even gone to f16 and still had a really good shot. Because I didn't have to worry about blurry backgrounds or anything else, I want, it's okay to kind of maximize your depth of field with this because you don't have anything else to worry about. It's just the flower, and if any part of this flower is not in focus, the important parts, then the whole image doesn't work. So it's better to get it sharp and in focus than anything else. So that's what kind of drove that decision. On the left is La Tourelle Falls in the Columbia River Gorge. This is one I shot at f14 for a couple of reasons. The log in the lower left is a really important part of this scene for me. I wanted that to be in focus. I wanted all of these plants in the midground to be in focus. And the columnar basalt in the background here, I also wanted to be nice and sharp because this is a really cool feature of this image. So I wanted a very deep depth of field in this image because I'm working with a lot of distances. Because I was a little bit of ways away from this log, I knew that at f14 I would have enough space, enough room in my depth of field that I could get the whole image acceptably sharp. On the left is an image from Antelope Canyon down in Arizona. A fairly flat scene. I wanted, of course, everything right around the light beam, right in the middle of this image to be sharp. All the way up top here. I was a little bit less concerned with this jut of rock on the right because everybody's eyes are going to go right here to the middle of the scene. And this had to be in focus. And it was really important in the canyons because it's dark and light and it's a crazy shooting situation. Getting the right shutter speed was very, very important to capture this scene. So I was more focused around managing shutter speed and having an acceptable aperture to get what I wanted in focus. On the left is a shot out of the White Mountains in California, and it looks like a fairly flat scene, which it is, but I was really close to the subject, the pine cones, the rocks, and the snow. I was really, really close to that, and I wanted to make sure that everything was in focus. I didn't care about shutter speeds. I was only concerned about getting the entire image in focus, and that's why I shot this at f/16. On the right from Silver Falls State Park, again, same kind of principle. I've got the trees in the foreground and I'm fairly close to those. And then I've got the rock face in the background, and I want both of those acceptably sharp. So that's why I chose f/14. I could have shot it at 14, 16, maybe even 18. You start to get a little diffraction and weird optical things when you start getting up into 18, 20, and 22, depending on the quality of your lenses. So I try to go no higher than f/16, but I will go when I need to. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you at the next brown bag. Thank you. Bye-bye.